Serious, scientists of Reddit, what is the worst thing that has happened in your lab? A girl in my lab forgot to turn the blower on in the hood and inhaled a small amount of an E. coli toxin we were supposed to put in solution. Didn't feel well, went to the got pneumonia, then got an intestinal infection. Her mom had to fly to the East Coast from California to take care of her when she couldn't leave her apartment for 2 weeks. It's a month later and she still hasn't fully recovered. That's scary as frick. I was in undergrad, getting some experience in a mosquito genetics lab. I heeded my copious amounts of safety and PPE training, and always made sure to wear pants, closed-toed shoes, gloves, and goggles. However, contrary to what my professors had always told me, absolutely nobody else gave a crap about wearing PPE. After a decent while of being teased by my supervisors and fellow undergrads, I decided to cast off my previous training and wear shorts and sandals. On that very day, we were moving some glass mosquito cages around the lab. The bottom fell out, shattering not only glass, but also a swarm of live mosquitoes all over the floor and my feet. I wear PPE again now. Anyone who teased you for wearing proper PPE should not be working in a lab. I hope they got punished. I have a few from the lab I work in. 1. Grad student decided to boil HF, hydrofluoric acid, for some experiment. Decided to do it on the multi-liter scale, and decided to do it in a fume hood that had nowhere near the capacity or the construction to safely evacuate with the fumes. He then left it over the weekend with no notes about what it was and no nearby placement of the calcium paste. The fumes escaped into the lab and hallway. Luckily no one was hurt. Cleanup was intense as the excess fumes had condensed and left a few centimeter thick HF film over the entire hood. We ended up using about 20 L of sodium bicarbonate solution in spray bottles to finally neutralize and clean the thing. 2. Grad student uses Aqua Regia to clean his glassware, like everyone else. Only rather than make a new batch each time, he decided to make enough to fill a 4L solvent bottle that used a cap made out of a plastic with groups that would react with nitric acid. It got knocked over one day. Again, luckily nobody hurt, but some considerable damage was caused. 3. Grad student decides to use an ultracentrifuge, needing to spin at about 1 million grams, 9,800 kms2. Decides to load it with all his samples on one side of the drum, unbalanced. During spin up, the drum rips itself off the motor arm and shreds the interior machinery as it bounced around. RIP ultracentrifuge. Luckily it failed during spin up, as if it had failed at max speed it probably would have shot out of the housing and gone through the wall or killed someone. 4. Grad student decides to show his father around the NMR facility, specifically the 700 MHz instrument as it is operational. Said father has a pacemaker, caused irregularities in the pacemaker's operation. Luckily nothing too serious, still had to go to the hospital. There's some other stuff, but those are the big ones. I hate you a little bit for telling that ultracentrifuge story right now. Every time I've seen one of those spin up, I have this gut fear that the drum is going to rip out and spray shrapnel across the room, but convinced myself it couldn't happen. Now I know that all it takes is an idiot and some bad luck.
Hey, Updude here. With Yahaha Studio, you can now play God, but without all the real-life miseries of tsunamis, pandemics, and mean YouTube comments. This brand new platform allows you to create your own 3D multiplayer games without any coding knowledge. That's for nerds, like the people who created this thing. Pick your template. Let's do an office space. Sorry for triggering the homeworkers. Add a component card to your assets. This one allows the player to transform into any object they touch. Because hey, aren't video games a way to escape reality? Then add one of millions of 3D assets, drag it somewhere, and add your component to it. Then click play and try it out. Hide and seek. Just transformed into this NPC, and now let me hide around here. Do you need friends? Ugh, me too. Well, good, because you can make new friends in Yahaha, and you can invite your pre-existing friends, if any at all, to join you in your game and other immersive events. If you want to become your own deity, click the link in the description or scan this QR code and start creating your dream games in Yahaha for free.
PhD student didn't have any pipette bulbs, so he sucked the chloroform into the pipette with his mouth for months until someone saw it. Mouth pipetting used to be pretty normal for all kinds of nasty things. It was once one of the most common ways to accidentally infect oneself. Grad student left a hot plate on, burned down her advisor's lab. Entire floor of the building destroyed by smoke and water damage. Nobody killed, but the advisor's rare collection of butterfly wings went up in smoke. He'd been studying evolution of butterflies and had to abandon that. Took about a year to rebuild everything and get back on track. That was 20 years ago, and I still have a big sign in the lab where people will see it when they leave. Is the hot plate off? Edit. Forgot to mention severe water damage in the entire rest of the building. The affected lab was on the top floor, so the whole department was pretty much flooded. We were all shut down for a while. I ended up staying in grad school another year because of all the delays getting the labs up and running again. I spilled a load of 35% Neo solution over myself. Burned right through my coat, overalls and pants. Quickly pulled down my pants and ran half naked to the showers. The pain and humiliation. I've never been more angry with myself. Really dumb. Postdoc in my previous lab placed an unrinsed bottle in the bleach bath to be picked up by the glassware folks. She didn't sink it, just left it floating. When the glassware guy got up there, he sank it to rinse clean it. Too bad the bottle had a bit of HCl in there and created chlorine gas when he sank it into the bleach water. A staff scientist found him passed out next to the sink. Oh god, that sounds awful, but that had to have been a lot of HCl left and therefore enough gas. That's a big mistake to make. Boil copious amounts of acid in our not corrosion resistant fume hood. People call it the crying fume hood because the walls inside are leaking acid and the bottom of it has this weird viscous liquid that never evaporates. I tend to keep that fume hood closed. People call it the crying fume hood because the walls inside are leaking acid and the bottom of it has this weird viscous liquid that never evaporates. I tend to keep that fume hood closed. Sounds like something out of the SCP Foundation archives. Various stories from around the lab. Co-worker accidentally spilled a mercaptan in a hood. Being a crappy old building, the entire building filled up with the smell and had to be evacuated for the day. Mouth pipetting by experienced techs, organic solvents of all things. We had the proper equipment. They were just too lazy to get it. There was a communication issue, and someone threw out about $20,000 worth of samples. Many years before my time, it was accepted practice to heat your lunch in the GC oven, or to even make French toast. Guess the ovens were so precise temperature-wise it made awesome food. An undergrad intern was autoclaving large glass containers and screwed the threaded tops in as tight as she could. Then she brought them downstairs and left them to cool in our lab. Luckily we were all out at lunch when the lab absolutely exploded in glass shards and death. We found shards wedged into the back of our lab chairs, notebooks, etc. I'm surprised they didn't blow up in the autoclavers, that is when they would experience peak pressure and temperature. Previous postdoc in my lab had a bad habit of pushing hair away from her face whilst wearing gloves. She continued this habit whilst making her own polyacrylamide gels for protein separation. Only figured out it was very bad when her hair started to fall out in a very specific spot on her head. And this is why we tie our hair in the lab. It was the second week of my PhD, so my supervisor was still hovering around, making sure I wasn't disastrous in the lab. I was making viral stocks, so I was growing up about 10 flasks of virus-saturated RK13 cells. I'd taken a load out of the incubator and put them in the hood, when suddenly my supervisor says, "Why is there media all over the floor?" I check all the flasks laid down in the hood. No leaky lids, no puddles in the hood, but one flask has a huge crack on the front. That's when I feel a bit damp. I look down, there's media all down the side of my lab coat. Crap, my second bloody week and I've potentially infected myself. Luckily it hadn't soaked all the way through as most of it was on my lab coat pockets, so double layer, and my normal clothes weren't contaminated. Also luckily, I work with vaccinia virus, and, as one of my previous supervisors once put it, if you're going to accidentally infect yourself with anything while you're here, the smallpox vaccine probably isn't the worst thing in the world to do it with. so it wasn't that bad in the end, but I was mortified at the time, and I spent 3 weeks examining myself for pox pustules. Third year chemistry student chucked a lump of sodium in the aqueous waste, chemicals dissolved in water that can't go down the sink, by mistake, blew the container apart, and ignited at least one of the more flammable waste containers it was next to, which blew the fume cupboard apart and a hole in the wall. After that, everyone in the university had to fill in a full COSHH assessment for every single lab, no matter what it involved. I knew someone who, on the sarcastic advice of a senior student in the lab, threw about 10 grams of extra sodium hydride into his 50 isopropyl alcohol water-based bath. That was a fun fire. I'm not quite a scientist, but this is lab related. I was on a team building a BSL for lab. I couldn't even tell you what all the scientists were going to do inside the lab, but BSL 4 is the highest level of containment. Anyone going in had to have on a full containment suit. Well, it's getting near to the end of the project, and since the lab is not yet occupied nor has any hazardous agents in it yet, personnel is walking through without any protective gear on. On the exit to this lab, there is a large washdown station. Basically, the doors close, and everyone gets hosed down with something like bleach to ensure nothing gets out of the lab. The team in charge of that station was preparing to test it when another team walking the lab tried to leave. They get stuck in the washdown and sprayed for nearly a minute, screaming in horror the entire time. Luckily, the system was only filled with water, but the people inside didn't know that at the time. This one is actually pretty funny, despite freaking out the scientists. Before I got to the lab, and was warned about always reading the manual for all equipment, especially where it comes to damage limits on other people's equipment based on this anecdote. Keep in mind this happened at a national lab, so everybody but the grad student was a professional scientist. A grad student borrows a measurement device with 3 modules in it, each valued at $50K. He comes back and says none of them work. This information obviously surprises the guy who lent him the equipment, so he asks for the grad student to elaborate. I plugged what I was testing into the first module, and there was no response, says the grad student. So I plugged it into the second module, and again nothing happened. Hold on, interrupts the equipment owner. Did you stop to think that maybe the power level was too high and you blew up the first module? I did not, replies the grad student, slowly realizing the actual problem. And I'm assuming you plugged in the third module before coming to me, says the equipment owner, realizing the stupidity of grad students knows no bounds. I did, says the grad student meekly. For those keeping score at home, this grad student, without stopping to think about it, destroyed $150K worth of borrowed equipment in a matter of minutes. I'm a lab manager. Where do I begin? The worst one I have seen is when someone placed a vial of some HCl on a top shelf, then threw a giant funnel up there as well. You know, for fun. Of course the funnel rolled around, hit the bottle of HCl and came crashing down on one of my co-workers. She handled it with grace, ran into the shower immediately, and I got to go on a shopping trip and buy her some new clothes. Also saw some get hit in the eye with Trizzle and mouse guts at the same time. They did not handle it with grace. Just last week someone set a beaker of ethanol on fire and just stared at it unsure of what to do. Thankfully I was right there and moved the even bigger beaker of ethanol out of the way before it caught on fire. 1. Someone cleaned out a lab. Found a jar filled with oil. In the oil was a big lump. The jar had no label. They took this and put it in the queue for the autoclave. Anyone with some chemistry knowledge is probably cringing right now. So yeah, the oil was there because the lump was reactive metal. Best guess sodium. The autoclave heated the whole thing up to 121 degrees Celsius, and when the operator opened it, it exploded like a bomb in their face. They suffered terrible injuries. It is a terrible story, and reinforces what you learn in the basic safety classes. Labels, labels, labels. Treat everything like it's dangerous until you know better. 2. Recently it was someone making PFA and they let the solution boil. We had to evacuate the floor. PFA is paraformaldehyde. When it boils it acts like a very nasty tear gas that also happens to probably be carcinogenic. 3. And actually really recently, someone went to fill up a tank of liquid nitrogen, started pouring it into a tank, and then went for lunch and forgot about it. Flooded the basement with liquid nitrogen. They have to do a lot of reconstruction down there. 4. New student sprayed a bottle of phenol all over herself. Her postdoc handler was not good at chemistry and just had her dab it off. I made her take her jeans off and there were big burns on her legs, so we washed it with Peg. Peg is magical stuff. I keep a bottle near me at all times. 5. A student taking a biopsy from a mouse for the first time, held it gentle, tried to massage the biopsy punch into the anesthetized animal's back, somehow misjudged the pressure and drove it through the animal, which sprayed her with urine and blood. I had to grab it and snap the neck before it even came close to waking up. 6. A student in the building was playing with LN2, pouring it into his hand and showing off to his friends. He reasoned that if it could be safely handled on the hand, why not in the mouth? He drank some. So we are pretty lucky to have our lab around 30 meters away from the hospital. 7. I have just heard about this one, but from a good source. They have a 2-photon microscope for live animal work. It works by shooting 2 lasers into an animal or whatever, and they come from different directions. So at the point they meet there is excitation of the tissue and you can see on the screen what is in there. It means you can look at body parts internally on living organisms. The problem is heat. There is a lot of it, and apparently someone had been working on a mouse and bumped the power up quite high, and didn't realize that he had killed his mouse until the smell of cooking meat hit his nose. We had a grad student working with a relatively benign strain of Vibrio cholerae who didn't wear gloves or wash her hands before eating lunch. She got cholera. The doctors were baffled. We're in northern Canada, so cholera is not a thing. If you ever see a map of cholera cases, that one red dot in the middle of Canada is our lab. If you ever see a map of cholera cases, that one red dot in the middle of Canada is our lab. This made me laugh. We do a lot of field work in my lab, all by scuba. I've had lab mates lost at sea. We found them after a few hours, threatened by aggressive sharks. Our boat almost capsized during a storm. Couple broken bones and injuries. Once another boat almost dropped an anchor on my dive buddy. If it had hit him I wouldn't have known until it was too late. Science can be dangerous. Hey, you might win this thread so far on total lab size. D. I'm an electrical engineer specializing in power electronics, and someone in my lab almost went deaf when the product they were working on literally exploded in their face. We have these devices called MOVs, metal oxide varistors, which are designed to conduct and dissipate a lot of power as heat when the voltage placed across them exceeds a certain value. Well, this particular set of MOVs was placed across a high voltage bank of capacitors in order to protect them from overvoltage. There was something wrong with this particular product that caused these capacitors to be overcharged to the point that the MOVs began to dissipate the power in the capacitors. The other feature about MOVs is that when you dissipate too much power in them, they will completely short out whatever they are attached to. Those of you who know about electronics already know where this is headed. Well, the MOVs did their jobs, took on too much power, shorted out, and all of the energy stored in the high voltage capacitor banks got dumped into them all at once. Bang 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 bang. The sound was similar to a heavy machine gun at close range, indoors. People on the other side of the lab still had their ears ringing afterwards, but the guy who was working on it literally went deaf for a few days. Fortunately, his hearing slowly came back after that, but the doctors said that he very well could have gone completely deaf from the incident. So why do we use the MOVs if they are so dangerous? Because if you don't use them, the result of overcharging an aluminum capacitor is that it explodes and sprays boiling hot electrolyte fluid everywhere. There was another guy in our lab who was burned in the face by a capacitor like this, although in the end, it was a small capacitor and he recovered fully. TLDR. Power electronics are dangerous. My power electronics mentor said the experts were the ones that hid when the circuit first powered on. Throwaway, because of what happened. This happened around maybe 3 years ago while I was a contractor temp scientist. So I was preparing a 300L batch of cell culture media and I added the wrong solution at the end. I was supposed to add a manganese-based chemical and added a magnesium-based chemical by accident. All the medium was to be used for a high visibility and quality study. Also, some of this medium was given to cell molecular biology, so they also had to repeat experiments there. My senior scientist at the time caught my error from comparing batch and lot numbers of chemicals I was using maybe 2 weeks after our experiment was finished. Mind you, these experiments take 4-6 weeks to fully complete. Even if my senior scientist did not see the error, we saw the untypical results from analytical studies another department perform. Because of this, we had to redo the entire experiment, and I had to create a plan to get this experiment fully grown and finished within 2-4 weeks rather than 4-6 weeks, since the timeline was already delayed due to my error. Mind you, with all the operations costs, labor, and amount of consumables, repeating this experiment probably cost over $150,000 to do. All this because I added the wrong chemical, and mind you, this is just 1 milliliter that was to be added in a 300 liter solution. I owned up to it, admitted my mistake, busted my butt and plowed through it. I shall never make that mistake ever again. I triple check and always second guess myself when I make these solutions. My manager at the time was very upset with me, but appreciated how I handled myself in handling the whole situation. Since I volunteered to repeat the experiment all by myself without my senior scientist's assistance, she of course just double checked my documentation. In the end, she did cover for me and admit fault, which is something she did not have to do, and to this day and give her my utmost respect for doing that. 2 months later, I interviewed for a full-time position in the group and got it, and since then I've been promoted twice and have since transferred to another group that caters to my overall skill set. TLDR, added the wrong chemical to a 300L solution that compromised an experiment and wasted $150,000 of company money. My roommate is an engineer for a multinational machine tool company. She made a design for some drill part, and it had a small error that rendered it useless. There are 2 senior engineers that are supposed to check her work, but they basically rubber stamp it, because up until that she had never made a real mistake. The mistake ended up costing the company about $1 million evidently. I set the table on fire, finishing dissecting a human brain for the day and go through flames sterilizing every implement after soaking them in Ito. One of the forceps had too much ethanol stuck in the gap and a flaming drop landed in a puddle of more ethanol. The entire table was covered in plastic for easy disposal, also biohazardous waste precautions, and went up in flames in an instant. Resorted to putting it out with a squirt bottle. No lasting damage. The specimen had already been put back into storage, but the entire lab smelled like a campfire for a week. Not my lab, but a graduate student in an adjacent lab needed to sterilize cultures of anaerobic Clostridium. Rather than simply bleaching the culture and leaving it in the fume hood like you were supposed to, they opted to autoclave the live culture. For those who don't know what anaerobic bacteria smell like, imagine smelling someone else's liquid crap that's been incubating in a hot, stale room for a couple days. That's about it. Bleaching a live culture and then leaving it in a fume hood essentially kills the culture slowly, and then the fume hood exhausts the nasty smells outside. Autoclaving will kill your culture but does not exhaust any of the smells, and instead aerosolizes it to share its lovely goodness with everyone. So this grad student, in their mistake, caused an entire floor of microbiologists to evacuate the building because the smell was so horrendous that they couldn't work without gagging. The autoclave was also out of commission for a couple days to ensure decontamination of the unit and inlet-outlet pipes. I felt for that poor autoclave tech who was tasked with that job. I am a medical student and the smell of C. difficile is forever burned into my nostrils. I had a really thick suspension of a nasty mixture of bacteria, non-pathogenic but still gloopy and grim, in a syringe. The needle got blocked, and like an idiot I tried to push harder on the plunger and force it through. It exploded. Luckily I was working in a cabinet so my face was okay, but everything in the cabinet got coated in this nasty shit mix of bacteria. It took me an hour and a half to clean everything, and even longer to sterilize the place. Nobody got hurt so it wasn't too bad in that respect, but it made a mess. Contaminated. Potentially. So I had to assume it did. An ongoing experiment which set me back a few days, and was generally pretty nasty stuff to have sprayed all over you. We had a master's student last year that dropped crystal violet all over the floor. and just walked away and left it. Lab was purple for days. When I first joined my lab, a grad student created a bomb. It wasn't intentional, but he sealed a glass bottle of isopropyl alcohol he had just used with dry ice to flash freeze glycerol stocks. It exploded as soon as it came up to room temp, sending shrapnel through the lab, breaking more bottles and embedding itself in the ceiling. Somehow it didn't hit a single person, and that guy has his PhD. Undergrad accidentally pricked himself with a syringe full of mouse breast cancer cells. He was convinced he was going to die for weeks. He lived. The human body recognizes mouse cells as foreign and can usually get rid of them. So no, injecting yourself with mouse cancer cells shouldn't give you cancer, unless you're for some reason immunocompromised. Source was an intern that injected mice with cancer cells regularly during the internship. Learned this from supervisor. I was running attenuated Yersinia pestis, Black Plague, through a system designed to test its vulnerability to UV light. It was attenuated, meaning the DNA that results in it causing disease had been removed. So I had a carboy of approximately 4 liters of buffer solution with the Y pestis at a relatively high concentration and some caramel coloring to simulate the water being dirty and shielding the bacteria from the light. I start pumping the buffer through the system, and in a freak defect, one of the barbed hose clamps on one of the tubes. Picture a stainless steel tube with a UV bulb in the center with the buffer getting pumped through the space around the tube. Breaks off and buffer inoculated with Y pestis sprays all over the lab, the floor, ceiling, benches, all the equipment. Spent 6 years getting a master's and a PhD. I saw some things. During my master's work we had this completely incompetent person in a lab that shared offices with our lab. She was getting her PhD in material science but did not understand anything. She had to be walked through how to save files on the computer, what chemical to use, how to not mix certain chemicals, etc. To make things worse, she had this craphead friend that always hung around with her who would tell her all the wrong things. Well, one day she wanted to clean some crucibles and craphead told her to use acetic acid, since it's in vinegar so it can't be that strong. Our offices were in a larger lab. We'd cubicles in a corner of a chem lab. Not so safe, so we heard her go to the sink, run some water, and then we begin to get this extremely strong acid smell, like burns your nose strong. We all look around and walk out to the sink, and she has poured a large volume of concentrated acetic acid into her crucible and is attempting to wash it with paper towels, which are melting into her nitrile gloved hand. She has tears pouring out of her eyes, and the smell near the sink is an incredibly strong putrid acid smell. Of course we pull her out of there and ask her what the heck she was doing. She just says craphead told her she could do it because it was just vinegar acid. She still got her PhD, and I lost faith in humanity and my department. I ended up changing schools after I got a master's. In my PhD lab, I saw a girl get a needle stick while injecting mice with an extremely aggressive form of glow-in-the-dark human breast cancer cells. She went to the doc and they told her that she was fine because the cells would most likely die due to immune reaction. I was still pretty freaked out. In our lab we also had a jar of methacrylate waste go off like an IED. Apparently when pouring out the waste from fixing samples, someone poured waste that had catalyst in it. One of our grad students felt the bottle when pouring waste in it and it felt really hot. They tried to put it in the sink and run cold water on it. As they walked out of the lab the bottle exploded, sending methacrylate waste and glass shards all over the thankfully empty lab. We began to add inhibitor to all our methacrylate waste bottles from that point forward. TLDR. Labs are only as safe as the least safe person working in them. Labs are only safe when no one is working in it. Fifi. Sophomore year of my chemistry degree, and I was in organic chemistry. We were doing a semester-long synthesis experiment, and had just started the process. Part of it was melting sodium down and swirling it in ethanol to add a particular group onto the sodium. Directly prior to that, we had used glacial acetic acid for something or other. Well, not all of the acid had been reacted before we added the sodium. Now I don't know if you know this, but elemental sodium is highly reactive. I was gently swirling the flask with the ethanol and sodium, and some of the sodium bits went up the side of the glass wall and found some acetic acid. Sodium in water makes a loud pop. Sodium in hot water makes a louder pop. Sodium in acid goes boom. Sodium and glacial acetic acid is downright explosive. There was a tremendous boom, a 6-inch flame shot out of the mouth of the flask, and I almost had a heart attack. The professor supervising the lab looked up in mild surprise. He was very old and probably almost deaf. He retired that year, and the professor in the lab next door came running to see what was going on. I was very lucky. If more sodium had reacted, or if there was more acid, the flask probably would have shattered and I would have injured my hand. As it was, nothing really came off it and we went on with our experiment. We eventually succeeded in synthesizing ethyl cinnamate. As someone currently in my undergrad OCHM lab, this made me cringe very hard. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.